Here to discuss AI and the shifting defense landscape, please welcome Brian Schimpf, co-founder of Anduril, with Derek Thompson, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. Brian, so I want to do a little potted history of American military technology. I feel like in the 20th century, America was the world leader in a very particular type of military technology, which is to say large machines that were driven by and controlled by humans. And your company, Anduril, has a particular thesis, which is that the future of war is going to be unmanned and is going to involve smaller machines. So why don't you just do a little bit of military tech history for us and walk us through why this is your thesis and use that to explain what it is that your company does.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me here today. Very excited. So if you look at the military today, it doesn't look like wildly dissimilar from what you saw in World War II. You know, aircraft carriers, big battleships, manned aircraft, you got bombers, you got fighters. By and large, a lot of the same building blocks are still there and still flown by pilots. We added precision weapons, we added stealth, but fundamentally the character of how we fight war didn't really change in a lot of different ways. And the U.S. was always built around this idea of, hey, we're playing an away game. We've got to, be able to defend American interests anywhere around the world and be the backstop for democracy in a lot of ways and country sovereignty. And so we had this, kind of military constructed around this idea. But then, you fast forward to today, you see what's happening in somewhere like Ukraine, and things have changed pretty dramatically. You have, the Ukrainian military has built up, I think they're going to make something like 10 million drones this year through all the different, kind of small and large companies that have sprung up around this. The efficacy of all the tanks, right now, if you go out in a tank and you are a Russian troop, that is a death sentence. It is very bad. You will be targeted nearly immediately. And so the ability for these, lower cost systems to have an outsized impact is massive. Like another example is the Ukrainians had no navy, but they were able to keep the Black Sea fleet, Russia's one of the top navies in the world, at port, and they destroyed a third of it with these unmanned suicide boats, basically. So the impact of these systems is absolutely massive. And fundamentally what it boils down to is the ability to find things, to strike things, has gone up tremendously, both on very high-end militaries, and that technology has gotten more accessible. The big, expensive, hard-to-defend targets don't work anymore. So at Anduril, we've been building up all the technologies necessary on the software and autonomy fronts, on low-cost hardware, to kind of solve this problem across the board. So we're doing everything from, autonomous fighter jets, autonomous submarines. We're making low-cost cruise missiles. We're kind of working across the spectrum on these critical technologies of how do you have a 21st century military is the idea.
And just really quickly, who are your customers? You're selling to America. Are you also selling to Taiwan, Japan, Germany?
Yeah, so, look, we are first and foremost an American company, right? So U.S. military is our primary customer. And we view our obligations as helping really this Western alliance be as successful as possible. With that, we really value working with foreign partners as well. So last year, we sold these suicide drones to Taiwan.
What is that?
So these are basically like little tube-launched drones that have an explosive payload in them. You can think of them as very similar to what you're seeing in Ukraine, kind of these low-cost munitions that can be very precise, very targeted. So we sold these to Taiwan last year. Got me and the company sanctioned by China. They don't like it when you sell weapons to Taiwan, it turns out. So we've been really leaning in with international partners as much as possible. We're starting to do extensive work with Japan. We've had some fantastic programs with Australia, and we're starting to do a lot of work in Europe and the Middle East as well. But always with this idea of, how do we give these countries the capability that they need to defend themselves? And, worldwide, nearly every government has significantly increased their defense spending. They're significantly raising this because there's a lot of questions on, where will the U.S. be to backstop it? What do they need to have? And then one thing that Ukraine laid bare was the challenges of production in the U.S. are massive. So, the Saudis were shooting down these Houthi drones very regularly that were attacking oil infrastructure in country. And they were running out of Patriot missiles. The U.S. didn't have any more to give them, and it was a 2 to 4 year backlog on this. So they were literally buying them from Germany to get the supply they actually needed. So all these countries are really looking at this question of not only from a U.S. policy perspective, but just from an industrial capacity perspective, will I be able to count on the U.S. to supply me when the time is when it comes down to it? And so we've been really exploring this idea of how do we produce with them, how do we give them the sovereignty they need to be able to produce these capabilities, and really solve that core production issue.
So DOGE comes to town. They cut NIH by 40%, or at least the idea is to cut NIH by 40%. There's threats to cut the NSF, National Science Foundation, by another 50%. We're cutting billions from all sorts of grant programs. This is an administration that is looking to cut and cut and cut. However, at the Pentagon, it seems like the budget might actually, in many cases, grow. Obviously, I'm not so stupid as to think that you're going to sit on a stage in front of 100, 200 people and make the argument that the Pentagon should spend a lot less procuring your weapons. However, I would like you to make the philosophical and intellectual case that in a time when we're cutting hundreds of billions of dollars or attempting to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from America's science and technological frontier, that you deserve the money that you're getting. Right? There's an argument for America's military posture toward the rest of the world that says we shouldn't be spending $1 trillion on military. We should be spending as much money as we can to make American families as rich as we can and to use the posture of America's cultural and economic strength to persuade other countries to work with us. We shouldn't spend $1 trillion on the Pentagon. We should spend half of that, $500 billion. Defend the budget intellectually. Why should we be trying to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from the very pool that your company relies on to exist?
Well, you'd be shocked that I actually think the Pentagon budget could be spent a lot more efficiently. But the fundamental argument to me about why do we need defense is, let's go back to kind of pre-World War II. There was basically no international trade because shipping internationally over the sea, you had to have your own defense. You basically worried about pirates all the time, right? Like you were worried that your cargo was going to get stolen. And then countries were constantly invading each other. People were using force to get to their political ends on this. And so the world kind of American backstopping of the international kind of rules, the international world order, was not great, right? And so I think we kind of take for granted the things that the U.S. military really provides, which is a baseline level of security, of predictability, of, people follow the rules because we can enforce the consequences of not following the rules, right? Like we take this for granted all the time. The second part of this is I believe that the sort of hard power deterrence is a critical backstop for every other lever of peace that you want to have. If the U.S. did not credibly be able to backstop all the other agreements and everything else we have, it becomes very easy to resort to force, right? I think, there's a lot of reasons why countries go to war, but the primary reason is that they think they're going to win, right? Like Putin believed that he was going to capture Ukraine. The New York Times believed that Putin was going to capture Ukraine. All the headlines were Kyiv was going to fall in 3 days, right? Like everyone believed that he could use force to get his will. And to me, that is what happens when it is not clear politically, militarily, where the U.S. stands on backstopping that world order. And so I think this idea of hard power deterrence is ultimately the backstop against, kind of these infractions of with very serious consequences of people thinking that use of force will work, right? I think Putin reminded us there are bad actors in the world that will use force to get their will.
I agree that there's bad actors in the world. I wonder if, just play with me here. For the last, say, 100 years of American foreign policy, we have, for the most part, used our own manned military technology to fight our adversaries. That makes sense in a world where you assume that Americans will be better at manning that manned military technology than, say, Britain And so it makes sense for America to not just lend lease military technology to the UK in World War II, but also to actually get up and fight the Nazis in the continent of Europe.
Yep.
We're in a different world now, where unmanned technology is going to have the exact same skill, the exact same function, whether an American buys it or the Taiwanese buy it. Why don't we just cut the Pentagon budget by $100 billion and sell $100 billion worth of military technology to Taiwan and Japan and Australia and the Philippines and Ukraine, and essentially just outsource our military, because there's no concern that it's not going to actually work on the battlefield. It's unmanned technology. There's a human in the loop, I get it, but to a certain extent, it is working itself. So why not invert America's military strategy entirely and just sell this stuff to our allies rather than have the United States spending $1 trillion every year on the Pentagon budget with money that could otherwise go to eliminating poverty and extending healthcare in America?
Yeah. So the argument around like how do we arm our allies to defend themselves, I think is a sound one, and in many ways is what is already happening, right? Like I think that was the policy under Biden. I think it will continue to be the policy under Trump, which is fundamentally, you look at, again, Ukraine as a template. We did everything but pull the trigger, but we gave them the equipment. We trained them on how to use it. We helped them with targeting. And but fundamentally, it was their fight, right? And I think that is a pattern that will be the strategy of first resort for nearly any president going forward. Take a Taiwan scenario. I think it is important, again, as a backstop, play out the world where the U.S. had no capacity to take on China if the worst happened. That seems to put Xi in
the worst here, just to be really specific, the worst being China
decides to invade Taiwan or
cutting off semiconductor sales to America and basically disrupting the entire global economy because the highest end chips can no longer be exported.
The worst case to me is bad actors get to throw their weight around to go claim any territory they want and do whatever they want for their own strength purposes. That seems like a bad place to be in the world order. Like, I don't want to live in that world.
Me too.
And so the negotiating leverage that the U.S. has is wildly different in a world where the U.S. can enter that fight and win that fight than a world that it cannot. And if Xi knows he cannot, the U.S. cannot, that changes the posture entirely. So I think the strategy of first resort is exactly right. How do we give the allies the ability, the systems that are correct for what they need to do to defend their sovereignty? I think these are shorter range. They're inherently defensive, right? Like these are much more about how do you protect and withstand an invasion or an attack. But I think the counterfactual of the U.S. has no military capability, cannot, if called to it, be able to respond. That puts the U.S. in a very bleak position.
I had a conversation recently with two China experts about the fact that when you look at steel and cement, China makes something like 70% of the world's supply. Mm-hmm. When you look at electric vehicles, the world's biggest company right now is not Tesla, it's BYD. And coming up right behind that are two other Chinese companies. Right now, I think China makes about 70% of the world's EVs. They seem to have the edge in robotics. DeepSeek is maybe right behind OpenAI, Google, Meta, Anthropic on the technological frontier in what might be the most important technology of the century. Is China winning? Does China have an industrial base that currently would defeat the U.S. in any significant showdown in the Pacific theater? And I should add to that just maybe the most important statistic, that the largest Navy tends to win naval showdowns, at least in military history. China not only has the largest Navy right now, at current shipbuilding rates, China will have a Navy that's 50% larger than the U.S. by 2030.
Yeah.
Is it just the Chinese century already?
Yeah, I think the shipbuilding capacity was the Navy estimated at 250 times the U.S. shipbuilding capacity. They make half of the world's ships. Outside of SpaceX, China is launching an order of magnitude more satellites than the U.S. is. So there's, on this production front, they control rare earths, they control batteries, they control, germanium, which is critical to semiconductors and a lot of other things. So there is a lot of these critical supply chain components that they have strategically bought up the capacity for the mining, the refinement, the processing of these. They have underwritten the supply chain. They have crushed other suppliers in the market strategically as a national security strategy to choke point the supply on these things. Like, there's no question that they are in this to have control. And you can see the consequences of their control. Like a really trivial example, I think Australia at one point noted that somebody in the affiliated with the Australian government noted that they said that what was happening with the Uyghurs was genocide. The next day, China cut all of the wine imports from Australia and zeroed it out, as well as several other things. So they will use that control to their advantage whenever possible. So I do think it is something to be very cautious with. On the military side, I agree with you that, the mass does really matter, right? Like the U.S. theory of victory is very much based around this idea that the conflicts of the future will look like the Gulf War, where it was essentially decisive and it was over in like 10 days, right? And that is what the conflicts of the future will look like. That this idea that we will have overwhelming firepower, sophisticated weapons, and they'll be so much better. The current war, like if you war game out, most of these war games estimate that we would be out of key munitions in a China fight in 8 days. Like crazy, right? And so the strategy is based around this idea that our overwhelming superiority and technical sophistication will be able to dominate. History is not very favorable to that argument, right? Like it is, you look at Ukraine, you look at most of these conflicts, it is protracted, and it is a production and industrial scale thing. World War II, right? Like we were able to outproduce the Germans. I think, one of my favorite statistics is we were producing bombers every 63 minutes in World War II, like absolutely insane rates that we could produce these things. So I think this industrial capacity question is a critical national security question. And this is something we spend a lot of time thinking about, which is it is not enough to have a technically superior capability. You have to be able to produce this at scale and rapidly, right? Like in World War II, it took us 2 years to reprogram the U.S. economy to a wartime production. And I do not believe we will have 2 years in any conflict where we need to be prepared to respond. And so you have to prepare for this in advance. You have to tap into commercial supply chains. You have to build up this American supply base that can actually respond to these things. And I think it does exist. Like the automotive supply, the industrial supply is quite good. It's just different than who has participated in defense historically.
And I want to be extremely clear. I don't want to seem to be saber rattling here. Like I'm not looking forward to World War III. In many cases, I think, and you and I've talked before about this, there's a degree to which a strong American industrial base serves as a deterrent to war in the Pacific because China perceives it to be so difficult to win certain conflicts that those conflicts never happen in the first place. So I don't want the line of questioning to seem like, how do we win a war? In many cases, this is about preventing war in the first place. That said, when it comes to bottlenecks and impediments to building our own supply chain, I would think our own industrial base, I would think that in an ideal situation, what we would want is a kind of Avenger squad of trading partners that we source from and supply from. We're getting certain rare earth minerals from Australia, and we're processing them in Japan, and they're selling them to Taiwan, and we're finishing the computer chips in the U.S. That would speak to a world in which, for example, the U.S. would adopt a very conciliatory approach to its trading allies, not, say, threaten to invade our northern border, not try to antagonize Europe, and certainly, bottom line, absolutely do not start a global trade war which raises the cost of manufacturing inputs that drives up the price of literally everything that you make in America. Which brings me to the tariffs. How are they going for you? You make stuff with steel, you make stuff with aluminum, you make stuff with fasteners, nuts and bolts and nails. As far as I can tell, based on manufacturing surveys and corporate statements, the cost of all these things is going up. Mm-hmm. How's the trade war going?
So, we have a by and large, kind of American supply chain. And yeah, once you get down to the raw materials, that's going to be volatile, unpredictable. And yes, more predictability would be great, but it is what it is. And when we've actually looked at the economic impact of this, it's actually quite marginal for us, which is surprising. There's certain things that's bad, but it is on the whole, it's quite marginal. But I think fundamentally, your point is right, which is the goal is to kind of have the right configurations with the right allies, to have more of a strategic view to where we want to end up with our trading partners and our allies on this. Is the current tactics going to get us there or not? It's hard to say. I don't know. But I think I honestly do believe a bit of a reset was necessary, especially with China, right? Like I think the reset on these things and getting kind of shocking the system, exactly the negotiating tactics. I've never been in that seat. I don't know. But a lot of the other things weren't working.
Can you say one more detail about what was wrong about the system that needed to be shocked?
I think a lot of the things I highlighted, right? Like they had done active strategies to undermine international supply of these key things, of these key materials, and have, multiple examples of, state-funded underwriting of capacity to underprice the market to get into control of those things, right? So like there is bad behavior on the other side that is anti-competitive and destructive to U.S. national security interests, business interests, growth interests, while simultaneously preventing any American companies from participating in a Chinese economy. And so I think a lot of other trading partners, I think a more nuanced approach is right. I think on the China front, it is a pretty complicated situation. I do think the national security concerns are important. It's not purely an economic concern. Deleveraging kind of China's position on this does seem important as a deterrence factor, right? Like if they have more leverage on these things, our ability to respond is highly constrained. And I think I think a lot of this comes back to how do we have a peaceable world order where they've demonstrated that they will use their economic power over a very long period of time in potentially very destructive ways.
Your founder, Palmer Luckey, is a well-known Trump supporter. I can obviously imagine how that's beneficial when Trump's in power. Barring some certain breakthroughs in biotechnology, Trump will not be in power forever. Are you concerned about the fact that the president is, and I think I'm speaking objectively here, a machine of negative polarization? When Trump takes a stance on immigration, it makes immigration more popular among the rest of the country. When Trump adopts a stance on protectionism, it makes free trade more popular with the rest of the country, right? Trump's almost like a force on a seesaw, right? That by taking a position, he lifts up the popularity of its opposite. Is that a problem for your company?
So I am a Democrat. I've been a Dem forever. I donated to Harris. Me and Palmer have different views. Like, that's perfectly fine. And I spent a lot of time on the Hill. The national security community, particularly in Congress, is the most bipartisan, effective part of Congress. They agree more than they disagree. They want to have the most effective military possible in the most affordable way possible. Both sides, right? Like that is consistently what we hear. And they want anyone who's got ideas and is committed to that mission. And so I would say, on the whole, we've found incredible bipartisan support. And we spend a lot of time talking to people about hey, what are we trying to accomplish as a country? This is an essential function of government. How do we do this as effectively as possible? That has transcended politics pretty consistently, right? Like defense is consistently one of the most bipartisan issues. Everyone, by and large, agrees on the broad strokes of these things. You can debate top line. You can debate what's the right relative amount. Absolutely legitimate debates. But having the most effective, strong U.S. military, that tends to be a pretty consensus position on both sides of the aisle.
I wrote a book with Ezra Klein called Abundance that came out 6 weeks ago, and it's about, among other things, the fact that America can't build stuff anymore. We're bad at building houses. We're bad at building energy. I should be able to say that now after 6 weeks of book tour. I am not, and I don't think Ezra would call himself an expert in DoD procurement. Is our thesis that America can't build stuff, would you say it's also true of our military stack? Are there ways in which we are getting in our own way when it comes to building the kind of technology that keeps not only Americans safe, but also our allies safe around the world?
I mean, absolutely. The numbers bear it out, right? Like you look at, so the Virginia-class submarine is this nuclear attack submarine. It's probably the most strategic and critical military capability that the U.S. has. And as someone who works on autonomous systems, this is one of the, I think it's more important than anything we're doing. Like it is an incredibly important capability. We used to be able to make 2 or 3 a year. We're down to being able to make like 1.2 a year. And I don't think we've bottomed out yet. And a lot of that is the same sorts of problems you highlight in the book. I think you got a lot of this right, which is, sort of the accountability around figuring out how we can solve these critical problems when all these legitimate and important other goals seep into this. That gets very, very hard, right? Like the amount of regulation, the amount of oversight, the inability to bring new people into the supply chain. Like there's so many barriers to solving these problems, many of which the government has put in place, that I think a lot of those same themes ring true from my experience.
It's incredibly gauche to end the conversation on one's own book, but I am out of time now, so we're just going to have to end in the most gauche of all possible ways. Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.